was the chance find of a grave with Viking artifacts and the ship, a Viking longship.
The nature of that burial is like nothing we've ever seen.
The first strike of the shovel released a smell of burning that should not have been there.
Come on! Wow!
The ground had been sealed for over years, yet the air that escaped was heavy and foul, like something still rotting below. For centuries, locals in Nordfjordeid had whispered that the mound was cursed. Archaeologists came expecting to find a Viking treasure. Instead, they uncovered something that felt wrong from the very first moment.
It's almost as if these people have been butchered. The mortal remains, together in death.
We did have complete bodies, minus the heads, of course.
This was not a burial ship that honored the dead. It was a place built to erase them, and the secrets inside are worse than imagined. Beneath the mound, a Viking burial, too big to ignore. For more than 1,000 years, a massive mound stood in Nordfjordeid, Norway. It was called Rundahoggen, and it towered over the land like a dead weight no one wanted to touch. At over 30 feet high and about 100 feet wide, it crushed the nearby graves in size. Beneath it was the Michaelbust ship, and a man buried in it that locals believed he was so dangerous that the earth had to be piled thick to keep him buried. The size alone made it impossible to ignore, but no one dared to dig. What made it worse was that other Viking graves had been broken into, looted, and torn apart for anything valuable. But this one stayed sealed. Not because it was forgotten, but because people were afraid of it. They said it was cursed. Villagers warned that anyone who got too close heard noises underground, like wood snapping under pressure and iron twisting apart. Farmers claimed their animals refused to step near it. On cold nights, people saw smoke leaking out from the top of the mound, even though there was no fire. The air smelled sharp and heavy, like something had been cooked alive. Parents told their children to stay away. They said one boy climbed the mound and came home shaking and pale. He started vomiting. His hair began falling out. His skin turned cold. Within weeks, he was dead. No one knew what had happened. There was no wound, no disease. His body just shut down. After that, the warnings became rules. No one climbed the mound. No one worked near it. People let it sit untouched, because deep down they believed whatever was buried there had not finished burning. In the 1800s, outsiders stopped listening to the warnings. Archaeologists were searching for Viking ships, and treasure hunters smelled profit. The mound was too big to ignore. In 1874, Anders Lorange, a Norwegian naval officer and archaeologist, arrived with shovels and a team. Lorange was one of the early pioneers of scientific archaeology in Norway, known for his interest in Viking burial sites and Norse artifacts. Backed by growing national interest in Norway's Viking past, he believed that the mound could contain a ship burial similar to the already famous Gokstad and Oseberg discoveries. He expected to find a fully preserved vessel beneath the soil, loaded with grave goods and warrior remains. But as soon as they opened the trench, their jaws dropped. They could immediately tell something was wrong. The soil was black, and the heat still lived in the dirt. The smell of burnt wood and metal poured out of the ground. Lorange realized right away that this was no preserved grave. This was a scene of total destruction. The ship had not been buried with care. It had been burned straight into the ground. What they found wasn't a ship. It was a funeral pyre. As Anders Lorange and his team continued digging, they uncovered a layer of burned wood mixed with shattered iron. The signs of destruction were unmistakable. Thick layers of charcoal showed that a massive fire had raged here, likely for hours. Spread across the floor of the mound were over 700 iron rivets, clear evidence that a large ship had once been buried at the site. But something was wrong. The rivets were scattered with no order. There was no visible outline of a boat, no keel, no planks, no curve of a hull. The ship hadn't rotted away over centuries. It had been deliberately torn apart and set on fire, right where it stood, until almost nothing was left. What should have been a full Viking vessel was now a burned, broken shell with no recognizable shape. At first, Lagrange believed the fire might have been part of a traditional Viking cremation. But the more they uncovered, the more that theory fell apart. Viking ship burials were often filled with status symbols. Weapons were laid out carefully. Shields were painted and proudly displayed. Carved wood often survived in pieces, along with coins, tools, and decorated brooches. Even cremated remains were usually treated with structure and meaning. Here there was none of that. The weapons were broken, and the shield bosses were crushed and warped. Lagrange's assistants began to fall silent. One man reportedly refused to keep digging after pulling out a warped piece of what may have been a spear shaft, still sharp at one end but burned black. Another found a clump of fused metal so melted it could not be identified. There were no names, no symbols, no personal objects of any kind. It looked less like a grave and more like a place someone had tried to erase. Even the ground beneath the fire had been damaged. The soil was warped by heat. In some areas, it had turned almost glass-like. Nothing about the scene made sense for a man of high status. And yet the size of the mound said he had been important. Whoever he was, someone wanted to make sure no one would ever learn anything about him again. What they discovered next would send chills down their spines. A body buried in shields and silence. As Lagrange's team dug deeper through the ash and iron, they uncovered something that froze them. Inside the warped bronze vessel, they found the cremated remains of a man. Later studies suggested he had been between 30 and 30 years old when he died. Normally, a Viking of status would be honored with a clear display of power. His bones might be placed on a bed of carved wood, his weapons displayed at his side, his ornaments set out for all to see. Here, there was none of that. The man's remains were shoved inside a vessel, blackened by fire. Even worse was what they found above him. His vessel was buried under 12 iron shield bosses. Shield bosses are the heavy iron domes that sit at the center of Viking shields, meant to deflect blows. In most burials, shields were arranged outward, their surfaces painted and placed in order to show the warrior's life. At Myklebust, the shields were not displayed. They were stacked in a way that felt like they were covering him, closing him in. The effect was more like a prison than an honor. This detail horrified historians. Viking burials were meant to tell stories. They were a way for the living to declare the importance of the dead. Even in cremations, items were chosen and arranged to be remembered. But here, it looked like someone wanted this man locked away, even after death. The silence surrounding him only grew more disturbing when compared with other great ship burials. At Oseberg, 2 high-status women were laid to rest in a richly decorated ship. One of them may have been a queen or high priestess, based on the ceremonial objects buried with her. The grave included carved animal head posts, fine textiles, and imported goods, showing respect, wealth, and deep ritual meaning. At Gokstad, the man buried was likely a powerful chieftain or possibly even King Olaf Geirstad Alf. His ship was large and well-built, and his grave was packed with weapons, sleds, board games, and the remains of 12 horses, 6 dogs, and even a peacock, an exotic animal imported from far beyond Scandinavia. Everything in the grave confirmed his rank and influence. At Ladby in Denmark, another elite Viking, probably a local king, was buried with his ship, surrounded by 11 horses, dogs, and an arsenal of weapons. The grave had been looted in ancient times, but even the ruins spoke of high status. The arrangement still told a story of someone important. These graves celebrated lives. They declared power. They showed what these people meant to their families and to their culture. They were designed to be remembered. But Myklebust was different. It gave nothing. The question that lingers is why. Was this man so feared that even in death he had to be covered up? Was he an enemy who was denied the rituals of respect? Or was he once powerful, only to be punished by those who buried him? Whoever this man was, someone went to extraordinary lengths to make sure his name and story never survived. What was missing was worse than what remained. What terrified the team wasn't just what they found. It was what should have been there and wasn't. There was no hair, cloth, wood, beads, and tools. Not even a scrap of bone outside the sealed vessel. In Viking burials, even after centuries of decay, organic traces usually survive. These could be animal bones, thread from garments, grain offerings. But not here. It was as if every living trace had been wiped out. In many Viking graves, even fire leaves signs. Burned cloth can leave fragments. Human teeth often survive cremation. Bone shards can still reveal trauma, disease, or injury. But in the Myklebust burial, almost nothing physical remained outside the cremated mass. There were no signs of illness, no signs of wounds, no symbols of belief. It wasn't just death, it was deletion. The absence of religious markers was deeply disturbing. Viking graves often include amulets, Thor's hammers, or small figurines to guide the dead through the afterlife. Pagan or Christian, some form of spiritual passage was expected. Here there was nothing. No gods, no blessings, no sacred space. The silence wasn't just about identity, it was about belief. It was like this person was not allowed to move on, as if their death was meant to trap them in place. There was also no evidence of followers or companions. In elite Viking burials, it was common for loyal servants or even animals to be buried alongside the deceased. These weren't casual sacrifices, they were symbols of honor. Horses, dogs, and even human attendants were meant to follow the dead into the next world. This burial had none of that. Lorange's team believed that whoever this man was, he had been cruelly buried alone, with no one and nothing to carry his memory forward. Even the soil offered no pattern. Over 1,300 rivets were recovered, but they were scattered and melted. Not a single plank shape could be confirmed. No outline of the ship could be mapped. It was as if the fire hadn't just broken the ship. It had liquefied its form and splintered it across time. Despite the shocking finds, Lorange's team was working with 19th century limitations. Their documentation, while meticulous for its time, lacked the precision modern archaeology demands. There were no stratigraphic records, no residue analyses, and no carbon dating. Worse, the crew had no way to detect deeper layers or hidden structures without digging by hand. After several weeks of excavation, the dig was halted. Lorange, convinced he had reached the burial's full depth, packed up the materials and sent them to the Bergen Museum. The site was refilled, and the mound was left to grass over once more. Yet, in hindsight, Lorange's dig left critical gaps. No one knew the full scale of the ship. The exact dimensions of the hull, the presence of a grave chamber, or possible nearby ritual structures were never confirmed. Some rivets were found in unusual orientations, suggesting the ship might have had multiple decks or undergone post-cremation disturbance, but this was never followed up. There were no soil core samples taken to detect ship outlines or subsoil anomalies. In effect, Lorange opened the door to the truth, but stopped just short of walking through it. Modern archaeologists would spend decades puzzled by the incomplete puzzle Lorange left behind. It wasn't until 2024, 150 years later, that a new team armed with would return to Myklebust and finally uncover what Lorange could not. The 2024 reopening proved time had made it worse. In 2024, a team of Norwegian archaeologists returned to the Myklebust mound with technology Lorange could never have imagined. Their goal was to re-examine the site with tools that could detect what the eye alone could not. Ground-penetrating radar was used first, sending waves into the soil to create a digital picture of what still lay beneath. The scans revealed voids, collapsed layers, and zones where heat had warped the soil itself. These images confirmed that the mound was even more damaged than Lorange had suspected. The archaeologists followed with 3D mapping and laser scanning, recording every contour of the trench Lorange had left behind. They brought in soil specialists to analyze chemical traces that could indicate what had once been present but long since vanished. For example, high phosphate readings in the soil often suggest decayed organic matter such as food offerings or animal remains. In the Myklebust mound, these tests revealed scattered pockets that Lorange's team had never reached. Excavation in these areas brought new finds. Over 600 additional rivets were recovered.
Carefully recovered hundreds of rivets.
Many so badly corroded they crumbled on contact. A small bronze ring emerged, warped beyond recognition. Most disturbing of all were burned animal bones, the first direct evidence that creatures had been sacrificed during the funeral. Why had Lorange not found them? The answer was simple. His team had stopped at the central cremation pit and never examined the outlying layers of the mound. Without modern soil analysis or deep scanning, they could not have known where to dig. The bones lay just beyond their reach, sealed in compacted ash for over a century. But the discovery offered little comfort. The animal remains were badly burned, leaving no clear indication of species or number. Some fragments may have belonged to horses, which were often slaughtered in elite Viking burials, but the level of destruction made certainty impossible. The fire had stripped away all context. These animals may have been companions meant to guide the dead into the next world. Or they may have been burned not as honor, but as part of a ritual purge meant to erase everything tied to the man. The evidence was too incomplete to decide. The 2024 team recorded every find with precision instruments. High-resolution imaging captured objects before they crumbled. Digital reconstructions attempted to place rivets into possible patterns, but the ship's outline refused to emerge. The ash walls that remained from Lorange's trench collapsed further under pressure. Every touch risked losing more of what little was left. By the end, the archaeologists had confirmed the mound was in irreversible decay. What they had uncovered did not restore a story. It only deepened the void. But then, just as the search seemed hopeless, one of the workers brushed against a small glass bottle sealed in the soil. Inside was something Lorange had left behind, a message that had waited 150 years to be read. A glass bottle buried in ashes, and the letter inside. Inside the glass bottle were 3 items: A business card with Anders Lorange's name and title, a few coins from 1874, and a folded sheet of paper written in his hand. The paper was fragile, but preservation specialists stabilized it enough to be read. The letter was not a formal report. It was a private note, written in a tone that surprised the team. Lorange described his work in the mound, but confessed his fear that the grave was already beyond saving. He admitted that the fire had erased almost every trace of the burial, and warned that what remained would not survive another century. He wrote that the mound seemed cursed to consume its contents, that iron and even soil felt unstable in a way he had never seen before. The message was less about documenting artifacts and more about leaving proof that he had been there before it all collapsed into nothing. What struck the archaeologists most was the emotional weight of his words. Lorange wrote of sleepless nights during the dig, of a sense that the place was resisting him. He said plainly that he feared future generations would come here and find only emptiness. His frustration was clear. He wanted to know who had been buried in the ship, why so much had been destroyed, and why no identity had been left behind. He admitted that this unanswered question had troubled him deeply, more than any excavation he had worked on. For the 2024 team, this was more than a historical curiosity. It was a personal message, a time capsule left by a man who knew he was failing to protect the story he was uncovering. Holding the bottle, the team realized the investigation could not stop with documenting decay. If Lorange had struggled to identify the dead, they had to pick up where he left off. Using every fragment, every record, and every comparison with other Viking burials, they would begin to reconstruct the puzzle of who had been destroyed here, who was buried here, and why was he erased. By the time archaeologists finished comparing Lorange's records with the new discoveries from 2024, one name rose to the surface. Many now believe the man buried at Myklebust was King Audbjorn of Firda. He ruled in western Norway during the 9th century and became one of the most dangerous opponents of Harald Fairhair, the warlord remembered as the first king of a unified Norway. The story of his rise and fall gives chilling weight to the way his burial was carried out. Audbjorn is remembered in the sagas as a stubborn regional king who would not bow to Harald Fairhair's drive for control. In 876 AD, the two forces clashed at the Battle of Solskjell, a fight that became a turning point in Norway's unification. Audbjorn gathered his men and allies from Firda and the surrounding coast, but Harald marched with a larger force and the clear intention to wipe him out. The accounts suggest the battle was brutal. Harald's fleet outmaneuvered Audbjorn's ships, cutting off escape routes and forcing a fight on unfavorable ground. Men from Firda were trapped and slaughtered in close combat. The sagas describe Harald's warriors boarding enemy vessels, hacking down defenders with axes and swords, then setting the ships on fire so survivors had no chance to regroup. Audbjorn himself was likely cut down during this slaughter, his body broken in the mud or burned with his men. His defeat was not just a personal end. It was a signal to every local ruler who thought resistance was possible. Harald wanted to erase not only Audbjorn's life, but his power, his reputation, and even his memory. Firda's independence collapsed overnight. The people who had followed Audbjorn were left with no king, no freedom, and no choice but to accept Harald's rule. For Harald, the burning of Myklebust was the final step. A king who resisted him would not be honored in death. He would be destroyed so completely that history itself would hesitate to remember him. The question of why Audbjorn was placed in the Myklebust ship has no definite answer, but its scale suggests it belonged to someone of immense power. At more than 30 meters long, such a vessel would have taken extraordinary resources to build. Only a ruler with authority over land, forests, and craftsmen could have commanded it. Some historians believe it may have been Audbjorn's flagship, the central ship of Firda's fleet. Though this cannot be proven. If true, its destruction was even more deliberate. To take a king's greatest possession and burn it over his body was not only burial, but humiliation. It was a way of ensuring that his wealth and strength would not live on after him. Whether it was his own ship or one claimed for his funeral, the message remained the same. His enemies allowed him the grandeur of the vessel only to strip it from him in fire, leaving nothing but fragments and ash. If this mound did hold Audbjorn's remains, then his burial was a punishment. A leader who fought against unification may have been granted burial rights only because of his status. But those rights were twisted into acts of destruction. By burning the ship until nothing could be reconstructed, they denied him the eternal prestige that proper graves carried. By stripping his name, symbols, and identity, they ensured future generations would not remember him as a king, but as ash. The discovery of the bronze vessel holding his remains adds to the theory. The vessel was foreign, likely Celtic, suggesting links beyond Norway. This detail matters. Foreign alliances could have made Audbjorn dangerous in Harald's eyes. If he had been receiving support, weapons, or recognition from outside Scandinavia, it would have marked him as more than just a local rival. It would have framed him as a traitor who endangered the fragile process of unification. That would explain why his burial was treated not with respect, but with obliteration. The punishment did not end with fire. The shields above the vessel may have been a symbolic prison, a way of trapping his spirit and cutting him off from the honor of the afterlife. If the shields were meant to contain him, then Myklebust was designed to destroy him twice. The 2024 team described this realization as one of the most unsettling moments of their work. They had gone in searching for artifacts and found instead a political execution written in soil. Now, by piecing together the evidence, modern archaeologists see Myklebust as a grave that speaks of vengeance. For 1,000 years, the mound stood sealed, its contents hidden. But in uncovering it, both Lorange and the modern team brought Audbjorn's name back into the story. What was meant to be erased has now returned, and with it, the uncomfortable truth that Norway's birth as a kingdom was forged in fire and silence. The grave that refused to stay silent. The Myklebust mound forces a question that cuts deeper than any artifact. If a king could be burned, hidden, and stripped of identity, how many others were erased without a trace? Archaeology depends on what survives, yet here survival was the very thing denied. Every decision made in this burial, the fire, the shields, the silence, was meant to destroy history itself. The 2024 excavation showed that even time seemed to obey that command. Objects that should have lasted a millennium collapsed into dust. Wood, cloth, bone, and metal all failed to speak. It was as if the site had been designed to rot faster, to leave nothing for those who came after. What remained was not memory, but warning. For archaeologists, the mound became less a source of answers and more a mirror. They were forced to face how fragile the past truly is and how much of it may have been deliberately removed. Myklebust is terrifying not only for what was done to one man, but for the possibility that history itself is full of similar graves, silent and waiting, built to erase. The haunting power of the mound lies in this uncertainty. It does not tell us who the man was with certainty, nor why his fate was sealed in fire. It tells us something far worse, that even in death, power can still decide who is remembered and who is meant to disappear forever.